Literary criticism is basically any form of writing that interprets or evaluates the worth of a work of literature. And the word criticism in this context simply means appreciating the value and attending to the merits and defects of a work. Literary criticism can be such a beautiful genre of writing. It is often the case that criticism seems stale or stuffy or too academic, but a good critic will make you see things that otherwise you would not have seen. And in that sense, a good critic will help you to see and to notice more beauty in your own reading, a way to find more meaning in the works of literature than you previously saw before. And so a good critic will convince you that there is something important here in this work of literature for you, and they will always give you ways of talking about literature, new ways of identifying those aspects of literature that are often very ineffable. So good criticism will be full of insights, enthusiasm, personality, originality, and even sometimes humor. So in this video, I want to give you 6 recommendations for critics who I think embody that ideal. These are also critics whom I think interested readers should read and will most likely enjoy. There are a few caveats here. So since a lot of you already read Harold Bloom, I did not include him here, although he is also great. Lots of personality, lots of erudition. He's fine. I also included critics from the 20th century and the 21st century who wrote on a wide range of poetry, and I mean from like the Renaissance to modernism or postmodernism. Otherwise, critics like Samuel Johnson or William Hazlitt would be included on this list. I think everyone should read them, and they're excellent, but they're not here because I wanted critics who wrote pretty much about anything in the canon, but were alive recently. So you should still read the Romantic critics and Johnson. And perhaps I'll make a video on the great critics of the past. But these are also critics from the English-speaking traditions predominantly, who worked mostly on English poetry or English prose. But all of them, I believe, are readable, fun, sophisticated, and perennial, most of all. So if you're new to criticism, I would recommend, for the first recommendation, the writings of Edward Hirsch. And I'd like to thank my friend Catherine for introducing me to his works. Hirsch is a great starting place for any kind of reader, a self-learner or a student. And what's more, Hirsch is also a poet. So Christopher Ricks once told me that some of the best critics were also poets. So he really enjoyed reading the Poet Critic, and Hirsch is one of those poet critics. There are many, and often their criticism is kind of has a certain vivacity to it that just the scholar sometimes lacks. Not always true, but Hirsch is an excellent example of a critic. He has a great book on American poetry, several books on reading poetry in general. I highly recommend his How to Read and Why, and this was the first book of his that I came across. He's sensitive, he's humane, he's also reverent, but also playful, and he's not preachy either. There's a difference between a reverence and preachy piety, and that's one of the reasons why I think readers who are new to poetry and criticism should probably start with Hirsch. I think readers of this on this channel who've been following these videos would also really enjoy Hirsch. So if you're a self-learner of poetry, this book I think will develop your moral and aesthetic appreciation of poetry. Now if you're a student at a university, I think Hirsch is especially valuable because he will attend to those aspects of reading that are discussed less frequently in the academy. The formation of the heart in response to poetry. Now, from the heart to the mind, we move to the second critic whom I would recommend. I've mentioned her several times, Helen Bendler, especially if you enjoy close readings, as many of you I know do. She clearly has a love for poetry, but her love is expressed in looking into the minutiae of poetic language and how a poem works, why it's successful. Many of us can recognize that a poem is beautiful and that it works. But when pressed to explain why you enjoy this particular poem and what makes a bad poem a very poor poem, we don't know. We can't often describe it. But even though it can be difficult to explain what makes a good poem successful, her close readings will teach you how to do that. All of our aesthetic responses are grounded in our engagement with the text. her close readings will show you why a good poem is a good poem. It's not about the message or its context primarily, whether the poem supports a particular belief or political view. It's all about the language itself. And so many of her judgments come from evaluating the poetry on its own terms. And this is how she's one of the great close readers who emerged from the new critics and formalists, although she differs from the new critics in some important ways. But I think for self-learners, I would recommend trying to find whether Helen Vendler has written an essay or article about a poet you already know. She has written several essays. She's written on Donne, on Wordsworth, Elizabeth Bishop, Rita Dove, Wallace Stevens, Jory Graham, and many others. So she's really written all across the canon. For university students and self-learners, I'd say advanced self-learners, I would recommend her Poems, Poets, and Poetry. That's the title of her anthology and textbook, Poems, Poets, and Poetry. It's a great introduction that covers a variety of styles of poetry from a number of eras. It's written by poets from a collection of backgrounds. And it also comes with a guide on how to closely read poetry on your own. She has a list of, I think, 13 questions. Very difficult questions. She used to teach with this list of questions and have her graduate students answer all 13 of these before coming into class. I've spoken to a few who have taken a course with her. I have not, although I wish I had been able to. And it's that list. If you want something a little bit more advanced, check out those questions that are in that anthology. Now, my third recommendation is Christopher Ricks. The poet W.H. Auden described him as the kind of critic every poet dreams of finding. And as Helen Vendler is the great American close reader of our times, so then is Christopher Ricks, the great British literary critic who makes rigorous attention pair with this very sharp wit and this sheer delight in language. It's actually delightful to read his reading, and you can do it easily, even if you're not an academic. Ricks has written about Donne, Shakespeare, Milton, Keats, Eliot, Tennyson, Wordsworth, Bob Dylan, many others, Alexander Pope, with scrupulous attention. And he's one of those critics who convinces you that reading poetry is about beauty and technique, as well as about the decisions that poets make and the choices they force on us as readers. His prose is elegant, it's playful, he's renowned for finding the exact word or the perfect, unexpected comparison that makes you see the poet freshly. And he once described literary criticism as simply being good at noticing things, and nothing escapes his notice. He is a critic who proves that close reading can be serious and sparkling and fun. So for self-learners, I would recommend some of his essay collections. The Force of Poetry, Allusions to the Poets, which you can read cover to cover, or you can just take out separate chapters based on certain poets. Excellent book. However you read it, make sure you read the introduction. He has another collection of essays along heroic lines, and he has several monographs on single authors, such as Milton's Grand Style or John Keats and Embarrassment, and also Bob Dylan's Visions of Sin. So I would recommend those to anyone who is a self-learner. For the undergraduate students or the students of literature, I would definitely recommend Milton's Grand Style. It's one of the great monographs that defends Milton against the early formalists of the 20th century. F.R. Leavis, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, they all did not value Milton and his contribution to English literature, and Ricks really defends Milton, and it's one of those books that just is heavy-hitting, fun to read. It's a page-turner. So my fourth critic I have for you is Frank Kermode. He may be best known for his wide-ranging criticism, but for poetry readers, he's especially valuable because of the way he connects close reading to the larger questions of interpretation and life. Kermode was a master at showing how even the smallest turn of phrase can open up these really significant and important questions about time, history, the poet's life, form, and meaning in general. His most famous book, I think, is The Sense of an Ending, and it's mostly about fiction, So he's focusing on fiction, but it's relevant to poetry too, because it explores why we as readers crave form and patterns of closure in language. Poems, after all, are some of the most concentrated examples of how we impose order on experience through words. And in works like The Genesis of Secrecy and his essays on Spenser, Donne, and Shakespeare, Kermode shows how poetry always holds something back. There's always something else to discover. He shows how interpretation lives in the tension between clarity and mystery. So where should you begin with Kermode? If you are a self-learner, I would recommend The Sense of an Ending. Probably the best place to start. It will give you a framework for thinking about why works of literature, even the most enigmatic ones, feel satisfying. He talks about how their forms mirror our own desire to shape life and meaning. For a student, I would recommend the book Shakespeare's Language. It considers the texture of verse, but it also shows how poetry's music and syntax carry such a vitality with it, like drama, the vitality of life itself, the very word vitality, psychology, and vision. It's perfect for building analytical skills that apply to any poet that you study. So the fifth critic is also a poet. So he's a poet critic, but he's also a mathematician. It's the sometimes hilarious, incisive, eccentric, and famously irreverent yet romantic William Empson. He's often considered the founding father of the American close readers called the New Critics, but he actually differs with them significantly. So the New Critics wanted to eliminate any consideration of the author and to focus primarily upon the work itself, to divorce the art from the artist, the art from the context, and to look at the well-wrought urn of the poem. Empson was actually against this approach, although he practiced the kind of close analytical reading that the New Critics advanced. He sees poems as coming out of a certain consciousness, and so therefore a poem is inseparable from its artist. And I'm actually quite sympathetic to Empson's view here. His book, Seven Types of Ambiguity, was written when he was still in his early 20s. It's amazing when you read it. It's beautiful, beautiful work of literary criticism. He showed how the smallest turn of phrase in a poem could open up ambiguities, worlds of meaning, essentially. And Empson had a genius for exposing the layers of irony in a poem. New Critics loved the irony of poetry. It's partly why Donne had such a strong comeback in the 20th century, and some of the Romantic poets as well. He's interested in contradiction, the doubleness in language, and the generalizations that readers often have to embrace by dealing with the complexities. So he wants to open up the complexities. He doesn't want to distill a poem into a meaning, into a prose meaning. T.S. Eliot made fun of the close readers. He called them lemon squeezers because they were often just squeezing the meaning out of poems or providing interpretations on them. Empson is kind of frustrating in this way. If you're expecting to have a poem explained to you, which you should not really want anyway, he will be frustrating because he's going to show how language is actually resisting a sort of closure. So if you're a self-learner coming to Empson without the pressure of coursework, I would say start with the 7 types of ambiguity. It's demanding, but it's also exhilarating, and it should give you a sense of his own style and whether you'd like to read more of Empson. Now, if you are a university student, definitely read the 7 types of ambiguity, but I would also recommend his book called Some Versions of Pastoral, which might be a better entry point for students, because as a student, you're going to encounter the pastoral everywhere, and this book is going to provide some helpful grounding. It's going to show Empson connecting close reading to the larger cultural and social questions of the time, the kind of move professors like to make in discussion seminars. Now, the final critic is somebody outside of the English tradition, and he's also somebody who writes a lot about world literature, Western literature, I should say. And I know a lot of readers on here are interested in world literature. I've taken some flack before on this channel about being mostly English-centric. That's my specialty, if not Western-centric, for which I'm not very apologetic. It's just what I study. So here is somebody who is writing outside of the English tradition, and it's Erich Auerbach. Great book on Western literature. It's pretty much perennial He's one of the great humanist critics of the 20th century, and his story is actually as remarkable as his criticism. He was a German Jewish scholar exiled from Europe during the rise of fascism, and he wrote his masterpiece Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature, while teaching in Istanbul, far from the great libraries of Europe. And the fact that he produced such a sweeping, erudite history of Western literature under those circumstances has become pretty much legendary, as it should. Mimesis traces how everyday reality has been represented in texts from Homer and the Bible all the way to, he has a chapter on Virginia Woolf. So Auerbach shows that the way writers depict ordinary life reveals their deepest cultural values. It's a book interested in cultural values, but also in how important these works of Western literature are. His readings are slowly patient, I would say. He takes his time. He has a comparative method, so he's really wide-ranging. It can be a bit dizzying if you're not widely read, but it's worth reading anyway, even if you don't understand some of the comparisons he's making. And they're going to give you a sense that literature is just one single, long, unfolding conversation about what it means to be a human being, because that's what literature really is. So where do you begin with Auerbach? Well, if you're a self-learner, I would recommend starting with the opening chapter of Mimesis. It's titled Odysseus' Scar, and it's on Homer in the Old Testament. And this chapter really sets up the central contrast that drives the whole book. It's famous for contrasting the clarity of Homer with the depth and sometimes mysterious obscurity of the biblical style. You don't need to read the book from cover to cover, but if you like the first chapter, which I would say is the most important, then you should go on. But you can dip into individual chapters based on what you've already read. For instance, if you read Dante, there's a chapter on Dante. If you've read some Woolf, you might want to skip ahead to that. Now, for the university student, I would say work through this book in order. There are 20 chapters, so you could finish this book in a month if you read a chapter every day during the weekdays, in the mornings of each weekday. Its cumulative argument is how literary representation develops across cultures and centuries, and it's really interesting to follow the thread of the argument from cover to cover. I think it's totally worth doing. But this book is such a cornerstone in comparative literature. So pairing it with Auerbach's shorter essays, like those collected in some of his earlier work, or his later work rather, can also enrich, I think, a study of this book. So there's more to be had once you finish Mimesis, but as you can see, it's a pretty thick book, but definitely worth reading. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and let me know in the comments if you have any other suggestions. I almost put Northrop Frye on here because I know somebody's going to mention Frye, who is excellent. I quote a lot of Frye, and I introduce him in a lot of my lectures, but in the company with these, if I was to do the top 7 critics, probably Frye would be number 7. I don't know. That's what I decided this week. And I think Northrop Frye might be a little bit too obscure for new readers. His style, he's got such great clarity, but his prose is a bit dense if you haven't read everything that Frye has. So, after you try these 6, move on to Frye. He might be one to go to after that. Thanks for watching, and until next time.